What are we discussing on today's Locked on Diamondbacks podcast? Brnadon Pfaadt makes his debut and his case for being a D-back starter. And are the D-backs the bounce back team in 2025?
You are Locked on Diamondbacks, your daily Arizona Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. You're listening to who? The always charismatic host of this podcast, Millard Thomas, multimedia journalist and graphic designer. So please go check out my website, MillardThomas24.myportfolio.com. On there you can see all my latest work, from my packages to my articles to my photos and my graphic design. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. On today's Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, we're going to be discussing Brnadon Pfaadt's debut. Are the D-backs the bounce back team in 2025? And who's leading the Kevin Newman role? So we got a whole bunch I want to discuss with you guys today. Thank you for making Locked on Diamondbacks your first listen every day. I would not be able to do this podcast without you, my loyal listeners. Sharing, subscribing, reviewing, doing all that so I could do this podcast for you. Thank you. It's free. It's available on all platforms. So please continue to tell your friends. One of those platforms is YouTube. Please hit subscribe to Locked on Diamondbacks on YouTube. Now let's get into the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast and let's discuss D-backs tie game against the Cincinnati Reds. 3-3. Again, we don't care about the results and the scores. We care about the players and how they're performing. And Brnadon Pfaadt made his debut for the D-backs. Of course, he is fighting for a rotation spot. Sounds crazy. The guy who's the number 3 starter for the D-backs when they went to the World Series a couple years ago. The guy who was the best D-back starter in the first half last season. A lot of it was due to the fact that he was like the only guy healthy, but he was also really, really good in the first half last year. And Pfaadt right now is battling for a rotation spot because we know Burns, Gallen, and Kelly are all locked up. According to a lot of reports, I mean, it sounds like Erod has a pretty good, strong inside track on a spot in the rotation as well. It's probably because of that contract and money he's owed. And so if you're telling me 4 spots in the rotation are already locked up and the last candidates for the number 5 spot are Brnadon Pfaadt, who's in your World Series rotation, Ryan Nelson, who's your best starter last year, and then Jordan Montgomery, who was the number 1 starter in the rotation to beat you a couple years ago, your options are very good. The depth is very good, but I'm still leaning Pfaadt in that mix. And like we've said before in this podcast, I would go Pfaadt and Ryan Nelson as the 2 guys to, finish out my rotation and then trade Erod and Jordan Montgomery. Monty will still probably be traded, but it just seems so hard to trade Erod right now. And so if you are able to trade Monty, put Pfaadt in the rotation as your number 5 starter, and then maybe use Ryan Nelson as your long reliever. But either way, good problems for the D-backs to have. Very strong depth, a lot of quality talent in the rotation, and it's insane a guy of Brnadon Pfaadt's talent might not even be in the D-backs rotation as they continue to preach winning over development. And Pfaadt right now is a guy who we look at as development, look at him as a potential breakout pitcher for 2025. But the D-backs continue to say, we're going to go with the best option for the rotation. And maybe Brnadon Pfaadt is that option, maybe he isn't. I believe he is. I just hope the D-backs front office and coaching staff believe that as well. A guy who was so good in the first half last year, a guy that continues to look like he's getting better on the mound year after year. I would definitely go with Brnadon Pfaadt to round out my rotation and look at my trade options for both Jordan Montgomery and Eduardo Rodriguez. This way I could also get Ryan Nelson in my rotation as well. So Brnadon Pfaadt, he looked good. He was around 93 on his fastball. That will tick up as we get closer to the regular season with generating whiffs. A very clean 2 innings for Pfaadt. He looks fantastic. He made his case for the rotation. Ryan Thompson, he continues to look good. He continues to be a revelation for the D-backs because, again, how did the D-backs pick up Ryan Thompson off the waivers? This guy's been so good for Arizona since coming over. A .69 ERA in that year they went to the World Series, 3.26 ERA last year, and the D-backs have just relied on him so heavily the last 2 seasons, and he's just been such an insane pickup for Arizona as like their 5th or 6th best reliever, maybe their 4th best reliever. Like Ryan Thompson has been so trustworthy, especially as a guy when you need a double play ball. Ryan Thompson is like the D-backs go-to guy in those high leverage situations. 2 men on, 1 out, and you need that double play ball. Ryan Thompson is probably the go-to guy in the D-backs bullpen for that sort of situation. He once again had himself a good spring outing. Also got a good spring outing from Yolbert Diaz, who is one of those intriguing pitchers who are super young, like the Blake Walsons, the Christian Mena, but Yolbert Diaz probably had more success than any of those guys last season. Like when thinking about all these young, intriguing D-backs pitching arms, yesterday we discussed Bryce Jarvis and Dre Jameson, and both of them have been effective on the major league level. But so has Yolbert Diaz. He was solid last year for Arizona when we had so many injuries to the rotation and the bullpen. Yolbert Diaz stepped up in both situations as he started 4 games, also finished out a game for the D-backs, right? 28 innings pitched, 3.81 ERA. The strikeout numbers could have been better. The walk rate could have been better, but overall was a guy that averaged like 96, 97 miles per hour on his fastball last season. Did the same in his spring game today. Like, he's a guy that could throw hard. I like his pitching stuff. Like, there's definitely talent with Yolbert Diaz. Can he be a number 4, number 5 starter for the D-backs? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe he does have a ceiling to be a mid to back end rotation starter. But even if he isn't, with the kind of arsenal he has to be a high velocity arm, if he could just be a future middle inning 6 reliever in your bullpen, 6 inning guy that could come into mid high leverage situations and just throw hard, Yolbert Diaz definitely has a path to being an interesting option in this D-backs bullpen. This season, the future, I like Yolbert Diaz, and he's also someone that's very intriguing as a trade chip as he continues to look good in the minor leagues and gets a few opportunities on the major league level. And if he continues to produce in those opportunities, you could look at Yolbert Diaz as a guy that could be a nice little sweetener to a package. The D-backs need to go out there and acquire somebody for a different hole in their roster. So Diaz, add him to the list of really young, intriguing arms for this D-backs bullpen. Then just really excited about Josh Naylor. He continues to look really good this spring training as he had himself another good game. He's currently batting 400, 455 OBP, and a 600 slugging. Christian Walker had a massive shot off the wall in his Astros debut in his first at-bat. But Naylor, 27, 28 years old, super excited about him. Will his defense be as good as Christian Walker's? Probably not. But offensively, is going to be a very fun race between those two guys to see who outproduces who. And of course, as a D-backs podcast host, I'm definitely going to be tracking the numbers because as much as we love Christian Walker and happy with the production and everything he did for the organization, I don't want him to do bad in Houston, but I don't want him to do better than Josh Naylor, right? So I'm definitely going to be tracking the numbers between those two players throughout the 2025 season. And speaking of the 2025 season, are the D-backs the bounce back team next year? We'll discuss that in segment number 2. And if you're looking to buy tickets to an upcoming sport or an event, then the best place to do that, of course, is going to be Game Times, because Game Time is the best place for last minute deals on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. They have this feature called all-in pricing. When you toggle this feature on, it shows you your total cost upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. You could get a panoramic view from your seat before you buy. They also have the lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Back here on the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast. If you're wondering why I emphasize segment number 2 so much in my teas, it's because someone pointed out, one of my listeners pointed out that pretty much every time I tease into the next segment, I always say, no matter what point of the show, we're going to segment number 3. So I need to be more mindful. When we head into segment number 2, it's segment number 2 and not segment number 3. So appreciate the listeners for checking me when I get stuff wrong. So now let's discuss. Are the D-backs the bounce back team for 2025? Because Jim Bowden, I don't know why I don't know how to pronounce his name. Jim Bowden of ESPN believes the D-backs are the bounce back team for next season. And when just looking at the standings from last year, specifically in the National League, he's right. The D-backs are the team to bounce back next year. It's a combination of what were your expectations entering last season? How did the team perform, right? Like, were they a disappointing team, right? Were they a team that just missed the playoffs, like the D-backs? And what did you do in the offseason? Did you fix your holes that plagued you from the year before as to why you didn't make it to the playoffs? Did guys walk in free agency and now you're going to be worse? And so when you're looking at the teams from last year and talking about the expectations from last year versus what they did in the regular season versus what they did in this past offseason, the D-backs have to be the answer for the bounce back team in 2025, because entering last season, D-backs were coming off the World Series. They added Erod. They added Jordan Montgomery, Jock Peterson, Randall Grichuk. This was a young team that spent money. This was a team that was a year ahead of its schedule to even make it to the playoffs. And so because of that, the D-backs went out in that offseason last year, spent money, added to the roster. And so we entered 2024 like we just came off a World Series when we weren't expected to be there. And now we just spent money and have this loaded up roster. And so entering last season, D-backs had serious expectations to at least make it to the postseason, and then we'll see what happens from there. But I expected at least like a second round run, right? At least a divisional round run for the D-backs last year. But because they started off so slow, it didn't matter what they did in the second half of the season. They ended up missing the playoffs. And so when talking about their expectations from last year, they didn't reach those expectations because they missed the postseason. When you look at their performance from the regular season, it was a tale of two halves, right? Terrible first half where your offense was completely in the gutter, couldn't do anything. Your pitching staff was in shambles with injuries and performance. But in the second half, your team kicked up from once July hit. D-backs, I think, had like the second best winning percentage in Major League Baseball. D-backs ended up finished the season with the most runs scored. And so if you're talking about a bounce back team, I think you would clearly look at a team that just missed out on the postseason, came down to the final day, won 89 games, and led the league in like almost every offensive category: runs, home runs, clutch hits, right? And so they had the expectations. They had like a regular season performance that would warrant you to think that they could bounce back next season because they were so good offensively and then just missed out on the playoffs. And so the third component, what did they do this past offseason, right? After just missing out on the playoffs, did they sit on their hands? Did they say, let's just try to run it back? Let's just see if we can just bring our team back who won 89 games, led the league in runs. Maybe it was just a fluke year. Maybe we'll be better in 2025 if we just bring everybody back. That is not what the D-backs did. The D-backs let Christian Walk go, replace him with Josh Naylor. They did bring back Randall Grichuk, but the biggest thing is they went out there and they added Corbin Burnes, a tier 1 starter this past free agency. And so now, when you look at this D-backs team entering 2025, we know they are hungry after a season where it took them 162 games to win 89 games. You thought you won enough to make it to the postseason, but then it comes down to the final day where you have to sit on the sidelines and watch two teams do a doubleheader that they split, knowing that they're going to split, because why would one team care for the second game when they win the first game, right? When you win the first game, it guarantees you your postseason berth. So why would you even care about the second game? D-backs had to be on the sidelines as the Mets and Braves had a fake doubleheader. Very disappointing to see. And so the D-backs now, super hungry, super pissed off with how last season ended. They are healthy going to next season. Gallen, Burnes, Merrill Kelly, the lineup, everyone looks healthy and ready to rock right now. And so when looking at who has the highest bounce back potential, Yes, it's the Arizona Diamondbacks who are completely loaded from their lineup with an MVP frontrunner in Ketel Marte, another guy who can win an MVP in Corbin Carroll, solid players up and down your lineup, a rotation stacked with Burns, Gallen, Kelly, Pfaadt, Erod, Monty, a bullpen that has some flamethrowers in the back end, and a team with a manager that empowers his players, a GM that is not afraid to get aggressive. Like, this is a team that has the bounce back potential in the National League. Plus, you just have to compare the D-backs to the rest of the teams. Like, if it's not the D-backs, who else in the National League would you pick to be the bounce back team? Like, you could pick the Atlanta Braves, but they made it to the postseason. So why would I pick them? Would I pick like the St. Louis Cardinals? Probably not. The Chicago Cubs are like the favorite to win the NL Central, but I wouldn't say it's like a bounce back season for them, right? I didn't have a lot of expectations for them entering 2024. And so when looking at the NL, there's not really a lot of bounce back candidates. Really, if you talk about Major League Baseball in general, who are the bounce back teams? It's the D-backs, and it's probably the other World Series contender, or excuse me, World Series team from 2024 in the Texas Rangers, not 2024, 2023 in the Texas Rangers, who also missed the postseason at a disappointing year last year, but I think have geared up a ton this offseason and are ready to rock in 2025. And so D-backs, Rangers, and I will throw in the Boston Red Sox are the three biggest bets to me to be the bounce back team in 2025. But if you just narrow into the National League, it's the D-backs, and there's no other answer. No team, I think, with the expectations that they had entering 2024, the way last season was a disappointment despite some really good offensive stats, then the fact that they did nothing but add this past free agency, give me the Arizona Diamondbacks as the bounce back team in the National League in 2025. Now we'll discuss who is in the lead for the Kevin Newman role in segment number 3. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. FanDuel is the app that is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly, no waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs, FanDuel has you covered. My favorite thing to do on FanDuel is the same game parlay. Whenever the Suns are playing, give me KD over on 25 points, give me Booker over on 25, and give me the Suns money line. When it hits, which is not very often, it brings a big smile to my face. If you want a big smile on your face, just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Back here on the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, and let's discuss spring training in that Kevin Newman role, one of the hottest battles of spring training. Of course, we got some other ones like the closing battle, who we all believe is going to go to Justin Martinez, but the D-backs have to do their due diligence and make him earn it. That backup catcher role up for grabs. I think Jose Herrera is in the lead for that, but Adrian Del Castillo, because of his bat, is going to have a case, and really might just depend on Gabriel Moreno's health, because if you get 130, 135 games of catching from Moreno, he could probably survive the other games with Adrian Del Castillo. But the hottest battle potentially in spring training right now could be who's battling for this Kevin Newman spot, the backup super utility role, because Newman was so good for the D-backs last year in this role. He really honestly blew away any expectations I had for him, because when the D-backs signed him, it was like a minor league deal, whatever it was. And I was like, okay, we added Kevin Newman. I didn't really think about it. I really didn't even talk about him. I didn't think he was actually going to make the roster and then have a real impact. Even after knowing he made the active opening day roster, I was like, Kevin Newman's probably going to be cut by like month 3. I thought he was going to be in like that Jace Peterson mode where he gets at bats, but he just like hurting the D-backs. He's taking away opportunities from young guys. Like, I really did not see the upside with Kevin Newman. But if you go in Baseball Reference WAR, like, he was solid last year. 2.2 WAR season. Great defense, had some clutch moments. Like, he held his own last year. And so if someone can just replicate what Kevin Newman did last year, I would be a happy camper. And right now in spring training, the D-backs have themselves a ton of options when it comes to who can be that Kevin Newman role. They invited guys both to be on the roster and not on roster who are battling for that Kevin Newman role. You got Garrett Hampson, Yamardo Vargas, Blaze Alexander, Tim Tawa, Gray Kessinger, and Trey Mancini. And all those guys have a different case and a good reason as to why they should be in that Kevin Newman role, right? You look at Vargas, and he's someone that has already spent some time with the D-backs. If you're talking about integration, it's easy for him to come over to Arizona because he's someone that spent his first 3 years with the D-backs. And then he also had a cup of coffee with the D-backs in 2021. So he's someone that's very familiar with Arizona, someone that did have a little bit of success in 2019, if you call it that. A .6 WAR in Baseball Reference in 92 games, a 269 average, and a 712 OPS. So he has had a little bit of a decent track record with Arizona before. And so far in spring training, he has probably looked the best at the plate. Now, he has also been given like the most opportunities. And so maybe that's an early indication that he's in the lead for the Kevin Newman role. But if you're talking about upside, like, Vargas really just doesn't offer a lot to me. I feel like I already know what I'm getting for him, which is just like not a very dynamic player at all. Yes, he could play some solid defense, but what other skills can he bring to the table besides that? Can he bring great contact ability, elite play discipline, speed, pop, like anything else? Can he at least be like a platoon guy that just crushes like left-handed pitching, like anything? And outside of defense, I just don't think there's a lot of pros when it comes to Vargas. So even though he looks the best right now and could be in the lead, I'm not super pro Vargas for the Kevin Newman role. Jordan Lawler is probably the most fun answer, just because he's the future. I think people would get most hyped if he won the job, of course. If you had Jordan Lawler and Perdomo on the left side of your infield, of course, Eugenio still a third baseman, but the days where you get to see those two guys on the left side just makes you giddy as a D-backs fan. And Lawler so far this spring training has looked solid. We know whenever he's been healthy in the minor leagues, he's crushed. The biggest issue is he has not been healthy a ton. And so I believe he's going to start the season in the minor leagues. I believe the D-backs want him to get as many starting full-time opportunities as possible. Maybe he's like a mid-season call-up where he can make an impact in the second half. But I truly believe to start the year, Jordan Lawler will be in the minor leagues just because he just doesn't have a ton of playing experience, to be honest, against really quality opponents. So start him in the first half of the major league season, see how his bat looks in the minor leagues, and then we'll discuss once we get to the trade deadline of whether to call up Lawler or not. The most intriguing player, though, could be Tim Tawa, who crushed in the minor leagues last year at 30 home runs. He kind of feels like the Blaze Alexander of camp this year, where he's the young guy. If he gets picked, it's like, ooh, what about his potential? He's oozing all this confidence. Like, you could kind of talk yourself into, could this guy maybe be a sneaky rookie of the year candidate? Like, that's how he felt about Blaze Alexander last year in camp. And it felt so good when it was actually named to the roster and then started off like really hot, right? And Tim Tawa feels like he could be in the same mode as Blaze Alexander last season. So he is someone that I think is truly intriguing, and someone that I do think will make an impact. Maybe not like a grand impact, but I do think he will say something for the D-backs this season. I do think he will have a moment, or at least an opportunity. Maybe that's better to say, because I do think he'll at least get a Jorge Barosa moment. We could come in and play a game or two. Maybe it doesn't really mean anything in the long run, but I do think he'll at least get an opportunity to play at least one game for the D-backs in 2025. So it is someone that I'm going to be watching out for. Gray Kessinger maybe feels like the most like Kevin Newman entering next season in terms of just a defense first guy. You really don't talk about his offense a lot, but is someone that is a little bit intriguing because he's still young. He was like a second round pick, I believe. Was he a second round pick? Yeah, by the Houston Astros back in 2019. So he does have a little bit of pedigree, only 27 years old. And for some reason, I don't know, he just gives Kevin Newman vibes. Maybe it's the way he looks, maybe it's the way he plays, but Great Kessinger, I could see winning the job and then just being like a solid backup defensive player. Then all of a sudden you're like, oh, he's actually batting like 275 and being like a solid offense player as well. So he is someone that does intrigue me, even though I feel like he's closer to the bottom of the power ranking. Garrett Hampson, I do like. He has speed, which could be a major asset and skill, and he has NL West familiarity, so he could give us some insider tips on the Colorado Rockies, about their pitching staff and their lineup, even though it's the Colorado Rockies, so you probably don't need that many tips. They're a pretty bad organization, but he's just someone that's familiar. He's played against the Padres, the Dodgers, the Giants. Like, he's not going to be scared in those matchups. He's familiar with all those pitchers. And the fact, again, he's a speedster. I absolutely love that. So I do think Garrett Hampson is an intriguing guy. But the man who I want to win the Kevin Newman role is the man who tried to win it last season and almost did. Blaze Alexander. He has talked so much about his mindset and trying to improve on defense and being that super utility player for the D-backs. He's talked about playing second, shortstop, third base, even some outfield, and he's accepted that role, and he's looking forward to taking it over and being the best version of himself that he can be in a super utility role. He said Randall Grichuk took him under his wing last season and really helped coach him up during those games where he just had to be on the bench and stay ready. I like the mindset that Blaze Alexander has right now. We've seen him offensively at least be good for stretches and flashes. And so we know the bat can produce. It's all about the glove because that's what really struggled for him last season. So if he can at least be solid defensively, I'm not worried about the bat. Blaze Alexander is my pick and the guy I would want to be the D-backs Kevin Newman in 2025. Now that's it for this edition of the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. Come back next week for more Diamondbacks news coverage and insight. And as always, stay safe, stay healthy. Deuces.